Hello, JeWeL bowling fans. This is Josh Lewis with another Tips and Tricks Thursday. We're going to be focusing on symmetric bowling balls today in our third segment of looking at asymmetric versus symmetric bowling balls. So far, we've talked about general core shapes, ball motion on the lane, and then last week we did a deep dive on asymmetric bowling balls. Conversely, in this last segment, we're going to look at symmetric bowling balls and discuss when and when not to use. And then we're going to wrap things up with an overall how to build your arsenal appropriately depending upon your unique style as well as what you routinely bowl on. So let's get to it.
Like we did with the asymmetrical bowling balls, we're going to start right around second arrow, getting the ball out to about 5 down lane. You'll notice the symmetrical bowling ball reads off the end of the pattern, but actually starts up a little bit sooner and has continuous motion in the back end. Even as I start to migrate left with my feet and getting that ball out to similar breakpoints down lane, the ball starts to respond a little bit stronger and more continuous. As you can see in that shot, running down the 8, going high. It has a very continuous motion front to back, very arc-like motion as opposed to that skid flip we saw with the asymmetric bowling ball. The further left I get, the less reaction the ball has unless I get around it a little bit more or slow my ball speed. Like we did last week with asymmetrical, we're going to look at speed and rev dominant players. First, speed dominant. I've got that symmetrical ball going quite fast on the lane, and you'll notice that unlike the asymmetrical last week, it still has enough back end reaction to make it back to the pocket. This is because the symmetrical bowling ball retains enough energy and is able to be continuous off that spot despite the overall speed. Conversely, with rev dominant, you'll notice I've slowed my ball speed down considerably, getting the ball to the same location, and it overhooks. This is because of that continuous motion, its conservation of energy front to back. With higher revs, this ball is going to overreact unless we get much further left as we did with this shot.
Okay, so now we've seen both asymmetric bowling balls and symmetric bowling balls on the same lane surface, same pattern, and a variety of releases and styles. I think that the videos kind of proved our earlier point around symmetrical being more continuous front to back, more continuous shape throughout the end of the pattern in the friction, and the ability to get further left and still see that back end continuous motion. So when do we use symmetric bowling balls? Especially when do we use pearl symmetrics versus solid symmetrics? Well, very similar to asymmetrics when it comes to pearl and solid. The further right you want to be with a symmetric bowling ball, you're likely going to be going into a solid cover stock. That's to enable the ball not to react too hard off the friction in the back end. That solid cover stock is going to have a tendency to read the lane a little bit sooner, front to back, losing energy, and therefore taming down that back end continuous motion. As you migrate inside throughout the course of a league or a tournament session, you're likely going to have to move from a solid to a pearl or a hybrid cover stock on your ball. That's to allow it to conserve more energy front to back and still retain that continuous motion. A couple of the shots that you saw me do between both the asymmetric and the symmetric was moving way left, kind of mimicking that double burn or that extreme friction scenario that you may see on tour or on TV. You notice that when I went to the asymmetric bowling ball, while it still made that turn, the ball deflected going through the pins. Whereas the symmetric pearl bowling ball, that deep inside, still had enough energy left to actually enter the 1-3 pocket and drive through the 8-9. So that's kind of in general. Let's talk about speed versus rev dominant players. With symmetric bowling balls, they tend to work better. They tend to allow for speed dominant players to be more successful. That's because of the conservation of energy and the continuous motion. When they miss right, the ball reads off the spot, continues back. Whereas an asymmetric bowling ball, missing right with speed dominant, it's never going to make it back. And if they get left with speed dominant players, the ball still has enough energy again to recover off that spot, but it's going to skid through that front part of the lane a little bit easier. Rev dominant players with pearl symmetric bowling balls can be a challenge because, again, the ball, once it starts that motion, that continuous shape, it's going to keep going. So if you miss left, that ball is never going to hold line unless it's a flood in the middle. But as they move left, rev dominant players with lower ball speed, they can end up circling the pattern, the oil, and making more room for themselves. So definitely symmetrical has a higher variety of use cases depending upon your styles. In general, when I look at general league bowlers, right, what do I tend to put them in more often? Definitely symmetric bowling balls. It gives a higher amount of miss room, more chances for left-right misses and speed changes and fluctuations or changes in release to recover. So again, more miss room. Now, granted, I would say the older players, and this is not to be offensive, but slower ball speed, less rotation off their hand, tend to go into pearl asymmetric bowling balls, allowing the ball to get down the lane, but still have enough core or inside potential for that ball to recover back to the pocket. So it really depends on the player's style. So last but not least, how do you build your arsenal if you're a tournament bowler, right? Well, obviously having a variety of bowling balls helps, but where do you start with? I was asked this question last week, actually, for a gentleman going to a major tournament. And I said, number one, a pearl asymmetric bowling ball. Number two, a solid asymmetric bowling ball. And then 3, 4, 5, 6, depending on how many balls you want to take, a variety of mid-range and low pearl and solid symmetrical pieces. I didn't get a whole lot into, pin to positive axis point or potential flare of all that. Just in general, a big asym pearl, a big asym solid, and 1 or 2 pearl and solid symmetrical bowling balls. That would give you the variety you need to manipulate the motion down lane on almost any variety of pattern. So one important thing to think about is transition. When do I know when to change from my pearl asymmetric or my solid asymmetric to my pearl or to my asymmetric to my symmetric bowling ball? You need to watch the ball off the end of the oil pattern, plain and simple. If you're watching that ball make the turn good, but then going forward too early or leaving a lot of flat pins, you need to get into a ball that's going to retain more energy off the end of the pattern. Typically, if you're in a solid asym, your first move might be to going to an asym pearl. Similar overall motion, but a little more energy in the back end. If you're already in an asym pearl and you're leaving flat corners, so the ball is still not entering the 1-3 pocket or the 1-2 pocket the way you need, migrating to a symmetric bowling ball is probably going to be your solution. If you go to a symmetric bowling ball and you go to a pearl, you're likely to stand in a very similar place, similar angles and lines as you were with your pearl asym. If you go to a solid symmetric bowling ball, again, a little more upfront reaction, you might have a tendency to move back to the right or closing your angles down a little bit to start with. So again, just watching how the ball reacts off that end of the pattern and how the pins react after the ball enters the pocket. Flat pins, flat 10 pins, flat corners, typically mean the ball is entering or rolling out too soon. Ringing 10 pins, or running down the 8 pin if you're right-hander, leaving the 9 pin, you've got too much back in. You need that ball to lose energy and stop as it hits the 1-3. So again, either getting more of the friction, allowing more energy usage before it hits the 1-3 pocket, or going to a solid ball to start making that transition from skid to hook a little bit earlier on the lane. Again, watching ball motion is key. All right, that's going to do it for this week's segment on symmetric bowling balls. This wraps up our 3-part series on asymmetric versus symmetric balls. And now we've talked about motion, what to expect on the lanes, and we talked about how to build your arsenal between asymmetrics and symmetric bowling balls to fit your unique needs. So next time you're in league or that tournament, be able to watch your ball motion on the lane and choose the appropriate ball to meet the conditions and your style on that given day. Thanks for watching this 3-part segment, and look forward to next week's tips and trick on a brand new topic. Remember to like and subscribe to the JeWeL Bowling channel on YouTube, and we'll see you next week.